I'd like to thank the organisers of the conference for this opportunity to present these data from our study of early life predictors of out-of-school suspensions from primary school, and I send my apologies for not being able to provide a live presentation as originally planned at what ended up being 3:45 in the morning for me. Out-of-school suspensions form a key component of many schools' discipline policies internationally, but they're controversial. Some of the reasons offered in support of their use include a wish to maintain a safe and orderly learning environment within the school and to deter misbehaviour among students. However, others emphasise the detrimental effects of reduced learning opportunities, their disproportionate imposition on students from certain vulnerable groups, and their potential to exacerbate pre-existing problems. Adverse outcomes that may follow suspension include poor academic achievement and mental health, student disengagement and school dropout, increased involvement with the criminal justice system, and adulthood economic disadvantage. In New South Wales, the Australian state from which our study draws data, most suspensions are issued to students in secondary school, as is observed in other jurisdictions internationally. Nonetheless, there's concern that these early exclusions represent particularly high-risk events for poor outcomes, and that the rate of suspensions are rising, particularly in the primary or elementary school years. There has been little research to date focused on identifying predictors of suspensions from primary school, with these years typically examined only in studies spanning kindergarten through the 12th grade, where differential effects operating in primary school may be obscured. Also, the majority of evidence on predictors of suspensions derives from US studies that often focus on sociodemographic predictors and disability. We were motivated to exploit the rich multi-agency records that we had available to examine a more diverse range of potential predictors, including sociodemographic, pregnancy and birth, child and family factors. An improved understanding of predictors of primary school exclusions could help inform the development and implementation of targeted school discipline policies and practices for these important early years. This study uses data from the New South Wales Child Development Study, which is a longitudinal investigation following the development of a population cohort of almost 92,000 children, using successive waves of record linkage of multi-agency administrative data for the children and their parents, supplemented by cross-sectional surveys of the cohort. Full details on the data collection linked at each wave of the study are published in these cohort profile papers. The linkages are conducted by a third-party linkage facility using probabilistic methods, with only de-identified data being provided to researchers. The New South Wales Child Development Study cohort includes all children who entered their first year of formal schooling in New South Wales in 2009 at about 5 years of age, for whom teachers completed ratings of their social, emotional, physical, cognitive and communication functioning on the Australian Early Development Census. This assessment is administered nationally in Australia every 3 years. In 2009, it captured about 99.7% of children entering school in New South Wales that year. For the present study, we use data available on the children and their parents up until 2011, when children completed the second grade of school, to predict out-of-school suspensions occurring between 2012 and 2015, when the children were in the 3rd to 6th grades of primary school. We used student enrolment and suspension records available for children attending government schools in New South Wales between the 3rd to 6th grades, representing about 2/3 of the cohort. We linked these with data available from these other agencies for the child and their parent, including information from the Australian Early Development Census, information about children's contacts with child protection services, their birth records, child and parent health records, and parent criminal records. Each of the exposures tested in this study has been individually associated with suspension, albeit typically in secondary school. For the first time, our study brought this diverse range of exposures together into multivariable analyses to determine those that uniquely contributed to the prediction of suspension in the context of the other predictors. We used a longitudinal design in which all exposures preceded the suspension outcome in time in order to mitigate potential reverse causality. Many of our indicators derive from the teacher-reported Australian Early Development Census of children's functioning at school entry, as highlighted here in coloured font. This measure provides a reliable and valid assessment that distinguishes children who are considered to be developmentally vulnerable on each area of functioning relative to other children. That is, children scoring in the lowest 10% of the 2009 National Australian Early Development Census population distribution. We derived the other factors from the various administrative records. Notably, we were able to differentiate the level of children's involvement with child protection services into a hierarchical variable. In decreasing order, these included children placed into out-of-home care, children with a substantiated risk of significant harm who were not removed from the home, children with an unsubstantiated report that met threshold for further investigation, but where risk or maltreatment could not be sufficiently determined or where the case was not prioritised owing to resource constraints, and children with reports that did not meet threshold indicative of risk of significant harm and were not further investigated. These were compared with children for whom there was no report to Child Protection Services. Our final sample was restricted to those children for whom all covariate data were available. This included 34,855 children. 4% of these received a suspension during the 3rd to 6th grades for any reason, most typically for aggressive behaviour or continued disobedience. 84% of children receiving suspensions were boys. In bivariate models, every factor was associated with a significantly increased risk of suspension of at least moderate magnitude, with the exception that non-proficient speakers of English were less likely to be suspended than proficient English speakers, as were children of older mothers. 20 of 26 associations were large to very large in magnitude. The strength of the associations reduced for many variables in the fully adjusted model, though the majority, 18 of 26, remained significantly associated with suspension. The most pronounced elevations in risk of suspension, of large or very large magnitude, were associated with male gender, prior Child Protection Services involvement, and teacher-reported aggressive behaviour at school entry. In many jurisdictions, including New South Wales, personalised learning and support plans are provided for children in out-of-home care at school. Our findings imply that targeted educational support might benefit all children with substantiated maltreatment, not just those placed into care. For children with unsubstantiated or sub-threshold notifications, a program of cross-agency support that includes allied non-governmental organisations may be required to improve their educational outcomes and avert their suspension from school. A variety of child factors reported by kindergarten teachers at school entry were associated with suspensions, implying that children presenting with these factors might be readily identified by school personnel for additional support as they enter formal schooling. Early aggression and externalising problem behaviours represent modifiable early targets for prevention. Prompt identification and intervention to support children demonstrating challenging behaviour in the classroom may avert exclusions and improve longer-term outcomes. Our identification of early life risk and protective factors for primary school suspensions provides important capacity for the delivery of integrated prevention and early intervention programs. We suggest that this should include a comprehensive cross-agency response, including not only school-based programs, but also support from health and human services agencies. Schools need to be resourced and encouraged to adopt alternatives to exclusionary discipline, for example, through financial support, dedicated staff, support in implementing programs with fidelity, professional development for all school personnel, and accountability structures. Greater information sharing between government health, child protection and education departments might facilitate better provision of universal and targeted interventions for students experiencing multiple risk factors for suspension. The additional support for these at-risk children is needed from the time of entry to primary school. Of course, our study must be interpreted in the context of several limitations. Available data on suspensions were limited to those issued between the 3rd and 6th grades for children enrolled in government schools only, and may not be representative of students attending non-government schools. Our study is insensitive to informal exclusions of children from school. There were insufficient numbers of suspensions to compare the different reasons for suspension. The various disabilities examined were those identified by school entry, which may underestimate the associations for disabilities identified later. Our index of socioeconomic disadvantage was an area-level indicator from the time of the child's birth. Individual-level indicators assessed more proximally to suspension might show different relationships. We also had no access to information regarding important school-level factors that also influence suspensions and might interact with individual-level factors. Such multi-level analyses may be possible in future linkages in the cohort, as will an examination of how these early factors relate to secondary school suspensions. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, the broader New South Wales Child Development Study Scientific Committee that helps determine the scientific direction of the study program, including representatives from our government partner organisations, and the funders of this research, particularly a future fellowship from the Australian Research Council. I can be contacted with questions or comments at the email address provided, and for more information about the New South Wales Child Development Study and other publications arising from it to date, I refer you to our study website. Thank you.